Anyway, over to you, Gren.
Right. Okay. So this presentation is called The Hybrid Work Disaster, which by some strange coincidence is also the name of my new book. Sorry, do I need to admit? And yeah, my name is Gren Gale. So if you're looking for me online, my website, books, social media, it's Gren Gale. No, Imo puts me up with Grenville Gale, which is my mother's called me that, but no one else in my life has ever called me Grenville Gale. So you've joined a august group there, Imo, you and my mum. So a little bit about me. Yeah, I've worked in IT pretty much all my working life. After I finished my degree in computer science, all I wanted to do was write assembler code, and I managed to do that for about 7 or 8 years. But gradually moved into project management, and I've run some pretty big projects in my time. So I'll come into that later, but my involvement in remote work goes back 20 years, which is a fair old way for remote work. And I published 4 books, 3 of which are about remote work or project management and remote work, and a couple of awards in both in 2022. I've spent the last couple of years working on this latest book, so did a lot of research to that book. But yeah, Analytica named me as one of the top 20, I think, influences in the future of work in 22, and Leaders Hum as one of the top 50 project manager leaders in 22. So I thought I'd just go through a history of remote work from my viewpoint anyway. So I wasn't around in 1729, but the first office, there's a little bit of argument about whether it was the East India Company or whether it was the Admiralty, but most people accept the first office was established in 1729. And there was a lot of reason for having that office. The East India Company at that point actually administered India for the British. So they had a huge amount of bureaucracy, a lot of people who all needed to work together, exchange documents, all that sort of thing. So they established an office. It didn't sound like it was an awful lot of fun working there. The day started at 10 o'clock in the morning and finished at 11 in the evening. And you did that 6 days a week with no holiday. And if you lasted 40 years, the big plus point was you did get a final salary pension. But the interesting bit on this slide is the bit at the bottom. So for 13 centuries before this office was established, most of the work we see now as office work was carried out from home. So a lot of it's sort of above shops. Whoever owned the shop would be doing their own books, or maybe they'd have a bookkeeper in who lived in the house as well to do their books. So if anybody tells you that remote work is a new idea, it's definitely not. So interestingly, I ran a remote work pilot. I was running a project for a large insurer. They were closing one office and didn't want to take another office lease out. So they had about 300 people that our challenge was to relocate them around the existing offices. And one of the things that we decided we'd try to free up some office space was a home working pilot. So we had 30 people, mainly IT people. So there were developers, business analysts, technical architects, project managers, worked for 2 months, 1 day per week. And as you might imagine, 20 years ago, the technology wasn't terribly supportive. Broadband was around, but it was quite expensive. So surprisingly, most of the people on this pilot were using dial-up. Obviously, no video conferencing, and phones were just for making phone calls with. Sort of reflecting what's happened in recent times, the staff who were on the pilot absolutely loved it. There was no commute, which was great, and they found they could be very much more productive because there weren't any interruptions, and usually interruptions were completely messing up their days. And it was an interesting piece of work done quite a while ago by the University of California, and they looked at interruptions during the working day, and they actually had some people follow people around in an office for about a week, I think. And the figure they came up with, which is a bit stunning, really, they came up with that people were being, these are knowledge workers, they were being interrupted about once every 10 minutes. Some of that might be an email popping up as well as people actually coming along and interrupting them. And if they were interrupted from what they were doing at the time, so taken away to a different subject, then on average it took them 20 minutes to get productive again. So it's not surprising that the lack of interruption was a really big thing and made people more productive. And when we did talk to some other companies about what they were doing at the time, IBM obviously had a vested interest in that they were selling the kit and the software to facilitate people working remotely, but they pretty much got themselves set up totally for hot desking. People could work from wherever they were. And the more surprising one really was Marks and Spencer's. I think they were in Stockley Park, and they were setting everything up with Citrix for desktops, so anybody could work anywhere. And for 20 years ago, that was quite a progressive thing to do. And actually, if you look at their literature now, for recruitment, they still very much advertise that they allow people to work flexibly. Anyway, so put all this together and put a presentation to put in front of the CEO, in front of the board actually, and the CEO wasn't happy. And some of the comments there reflect the sort of things that are being said right at the moment with this sort of hybrid, a lot of companies rolling back remote work. So yeah, he said, well, you told me these guys are working, but how do I know they're working if I can't see them? And we'd explained that, or I'd explained that they were very much more productive, but I said, well, how can I possibly believe that? Because you haven't got any proof they're more productive. Of course, we didn't have any measure of how productive these people were before we ran the pilot, so it was impossible to have a quantitative analysis or assessment of how much more productive they were. So the presentation went on for a while, but in the end, he stopped the whole thing and said, no, we're not doing this. And worse than that, he then talked to he looked at all the other directors and said, well, actually, he said, do you have any people working from home? And they all sort of looked a bit sheepish and looked at the feet at this point. But he basically said, all right, if you have anybody, you're going to stop it. So it wasn't a stunning success. I'd go on to the other people who've been doing this sort of stuff for quite a while. So GitLab, I'm sure you've all heard of, be familiar with. They were established in 2011. They've never owned an office, never had an office. Everybody in GitLab works remotely, and there's there's over 2,000 of them now. They do encourage people if they can to meet socially, but basically they meet once a year face to face for an all staff meeting. Interesting, in 2016, Dell stated 25% of their staff were working remotely, which is a lot, multiples above the average for the US. Then now it's up to about 50%, and they cited 12 million of annual savings. Said this was something they want to do. Although interestingly, there's a new CEO in place now at Dell, and he's now trying to roll it back. UK civil service, in terms of sort of things that were said after the pandemic. I know somebody who, as a graduate, joined the civil service in 2017 in a reasonably senior position, but they said as soon as they arrived, they were given a laptop, they were given a modem with some encryption, and told, you have to work at home 2 days a week. Not you can, but you have to, because in an attempt to make their ministers happy, they said, well, we can save an awful lot of money if we reduce office space and have people working at home. And obviously at the time there was some enthusiasm for it and it was all done. But it was interesting as the pandemic subsided that Mr. Rees-Mogg went round people's desks putting little notes saying, oh, sad I wasn't able to meet you today. He was sort of railing against remote working, but actually the government and the civil service initiated remote working in the civil service, so it's slightly odd. And I thought I'd just put that one in. I mean, the bottom one about Vodafone is a bit surprising, and even I'm a bit skeptical about the numbers. But Vodafone did a very large survey, 8,000 employers and employees in 10 countries, and at that time, I mean, they came up with the figures you can see on the right. 75% of companies had introduced some sort of remote working. 83% said they'd indicated a boost in productivity, and 61% said they'd increase profits. I sort of have the feeling it's a bit overstated, but it's interesting that in at the time, 2016, this was all viewed as really quite positive. So yeah, 2019-20, the pandemic came along, and there was clearly a huge a trial of remote working when 3 billion people took their laptops home and started working remotely. You know, I'll get onto that, but it feels like we haven't learned a lot of lessons from what went on in the pandemic in terms of some of the stuff that's going on. And you know, there are so many surveys that showed remote work was as if not more productive than working in an office. And there are some quantitative surveys that were done. Trip.com, you might have come across, our travel company. They sell train tickets, all sorts of tickets. Anyway, they are based in China. They did a trial where people were basically doing repetitive, sort of mundane sort of work, so it was easy to measure. And they did a trial with one team working in the office and one team working from home. And they found that the team working from home was 13% more productive than the team working in the office. And in fact, that persuaded them then to go full time with this, and they got even more productive. They got 20% more productive than they were in the office. And there's also an American company called ProtoScore, and they sell employee monitoring software. That they had some real data. They compared the again real data. They compared the first quarter in, or sorry, probably second quarter in 2020 against the same quarter in 2019. They had 100 million data points from 30,000 users, and again seems a little too large. But with their comparison of the data, productivity appeared to increase by 47%. So yeah, I don't think there really is any great argument against the idea that remote working is more productive. But interestingly, as soon as the pandemic subsided, yeah, and you can see that panel on the right, employers, most employers wanted to get people back into offices. But obviously employees had seen something they really liked the flexibility that they got from working at home, and that they wanted to hang on to it. So there was a situation where maybe a compromise was required, but I've called it a tawdry compromise. It's a compromise that I don't think really gave anybody what they wanted. So hybrid work, fudge. I think hybrid work, you know, from all the stuff I looked at, all the research I've done, I really do think it's the least efficient way of organizing office work. The employer gets some cost savings. I mean, they may reduce the amount of office space that they have, but I get the feeling, certainly a lot of announcements now of trying to push people back into offices, particularly recently. I get the feeling that a lot of employers don't want to. Well, they will have leases, which makes it, not, you can't just get rid of offices straight away. But a lot of employers not so convinced that they really want to commit to people working from home. So hanging on to offices perhaps longer than they perhaps should. If you walk around the city, you can see this. Lots of half-empty offices in very expensive locations. So paying a lot of money for these offices, then they're half empty. There are additional support costs. You have to support IT and you have to support health and safety in two definite environments, two distinct environments. And obviously, if you really haven't got much further in terms of recruiting talent than having a permanent office, because you really still got to I still can only recruit within the talent pool that lives within commuting different distance of your office. And from the employee's point of view, yeah, middle managers do have a much harder time, I think, running hybrid. There's, find it difficult to work out where people are, organize meetings, that sort of thing. And there doesn't seem to be again, and I wonder whether it's because the employers aren't really committed to it. There doesn't seem to be very much training going on. Most managers working in a hybrid situation aren't receiving any training. And middle managers are key to an organization running well. McKinsey did a specific study looking at middle managers, and they came to the conclusion that middle managers are some of the most important people in the organization in terms of really making the organizations tick. So you don't really want to be upsetting your middle managers. Yeah, employees get some flexibility because they're getting some days working from home. But the most common complaint I read here, whatever, is that the people are coming into work, doing the commute, get into work and find all the people they need to talk to, or most of the people they need to talk to, aren't in the office. So they spend an awful lot of time in the office on video conferences and think, well, why did I have to come into the office on today? Because we have to work Wednesday, Thursday, or it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I have to be in the office because that's what the rules say. But actually, I'm here for no purpose whatsoever. And it can have a chaotic air about it because there tends to be the rules set at the top and then left to the individual departments to sort out what they want to do, or individual managers. So you can find different departments working at home on different days and difficult to track people down. So it can have a bit of a chaotic air to it. And there is a risk of discrimination from proximity bias. There's been a lot of work done on proximity bias, and that's that people have not necessarily deliberate, maybe unconscious tendency to sort of favor the people they can see. And Stanford University did a trial with this with I'm not sure which company, I can't remember, but they found that the people who were working more remotely and were less noticed by their manager, even though they were producing more work, they were being more productive, they got considered less for promotion because their manager just couldn't see them as much. And there is a danger, obviously, with most hybrid setups that people can have to be in the office maybe 3 days a week, but they can be in the office more. That gives some people perhaps an opportunity to spend more time in front of the manager than the people who are working from home more. And CMI looked at who worked at home, who was most likely to work at home, and they found that women are more likely to take advantage of working home than men, women with children particularly, than men with children. So there is a risk in here of real discrimination as well. And coffee badging is a thing that people, finding I'm coming into work and I don't really need to be here. I could still be working from home. It's come into work, get a coffee, walk around the office, talk to a few people for an hour, then disappear back up home again. And people think you're in the office, but you're not really. And I think all this derives from this sort of office obsession that CEOs, not all CEOs, but a lot of CEOs are a bit obsessed with having to retain offices, but making offices the sort of center of everything going on. And if you read the one from Alan Sugar, sort of interesting, isn't it? That's the, if I can't see them, how do I know they're working? Sounds like a very Alan Sugar comment, doesn't it, really? But most of these things are about, they're saying, oh, it's you know, unless you have people in offices, they can't be creative, they can't be collaborative. Um, the comment from Elon Musk is interesting because it's interesting that when he was interviewed, he talked about it being morally wrong. And while Elon Musk, when he sticks up on Twitter or X, should I say, he obviously spends about 15 seconds thinking about it. But I think for his businesses, he thinks quite deeply. And maybe he thought he couldn't really defend. He wants people in offices. He couldn't really defend the reasons, perhaps. That's why he said it was morally wrong, because some people can't do it at all. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Some of the recent decisions to bring people back into the office, they all tend to use the same thing. They all say, well, you know, we can't be creative and collaborative unless we have people in the offices. And Amazon from January are insisting everybody comes back to offices. Some recent press release from Asda, where that they having to try and cut their costs, but it's interesting. Part of they're making some people redundant, but part of what they described was that they were also going to cut back on hybrid working. They said because they need to build high performing collaborative culture, which they're saying they can't do unless they have these people in an office. And Starling Bank's another interesting one. That Starling Bank was from the very start set up to be a flexible work company, and they now have their second CEO, and he's saying, "No, I don't like this. People can't be creative and collaborative unless they're in the office." But he has an interesting job in his hands because they've got twice as many employees as they've got seats in offices. So maybe he's planning on spending some more money on offices and increasing his costs. I don't know. So I had to describe what I think the future of work should be, what a sensible way of organising office work. But I thought to start with, I would just go through destroying these myths about creativity and collaboration. It doesn't work without offices. And it would be sort of understandable if there's a brand new research, but the research on this goes back a long way, and obviously has been ignored for a long time. The Yale University did a set of an experiment, and they gave people creativity exercises to do, and they had a number of brainstorming groups with creativity exercises, and they had a number of individuals as well, individuals working alone, and they found that the individuals working alone came up with twice as many feasible ideas as the groups did. The next bullet there is Keith Sawyer. Keith Sawyer, who is a psychologist who specializes in creativity, and he's acknowledged as a world expert in creativity. As he says, there decades of research consistently shown that brainstorming groups think of far fewer ideas than the same number of people who work alone and pool their ideas later. And you know, from both of these things, the office environment isn't exactly ideal for people trying to think about these things. You know, it's noisy, interruption-filled environments. Susan Cain spent 7 years of research putting together a book called Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. You'll also find she's very interesting TED Talks on YouTube. If you look on YouTube, you'll find TED Talks by Susan Cain. And she looked at introverts in a lot of detail. And as it says there, she came up with the conclusion that introverts were about well, between 30 and 50% of the population, and that they were some of the most creative people in society. But in particularly in offices, their voices, and particularly in meetings, their voices tend to get drowned by the noisier people. And still in the next sentence, the noisier people tend to get their way, and tends to, those sort of creativity that goes on in offices tends towards groupthink. The noisy people start to agree with each other, and the thing gets pushed through, and there's not enough challenge in these brainstorming meetings in offices. So the idea that creativity works in offices, I would say, is completely wrong. If I can't see them, then they're probably not working. I think that just is complete rubbish anyway. Obviously, I'm sure in everywhere you guys work or have worked, people have set objectives and they're measured against how they meet those objectives. And as I was saying there, one of the objectives usually isn't you must be present in the office. So yeah, I just don't think, even the worst sort of detailed micromanagers I've come across, not a single one of them has stood behind people making sure they work. We set objectives, we measure them against the objectives. And ideas at the coffee machine, water cooler, I think is, certainly from my experience, is an almost complete myth. And actually, I don't smoke, but what I hear from the people who do smoke, who get sent out of offices to smoke in the wet and the cold in some hut, generally, they seem to know everything that's going on in the offices. So in offices, there seems to be a democracy about smoking, that the people quite senior in the company talk to the people quite junior in the company. But anyway, I'm not recommending you smoke to find out what's going on in the company and to collaborate more. So flexible working. So this is how I think it should work. I would call it flexible working rather than calling it hybrid or whatever. Certainly not remote working. I don't think it's quite the same. And yeah, and it's not rocket science. I don't think Elon Musk is watching this presentation, but in case he is, it's not rocket science. It seems to me this is just logical, and it should be the way that things work. So everybody works remotely as a starting point. I appreciate you have to be a bit more flexible than that, especially if you were putting this in place in an existing company. Some people might not be able to work remotely, or might be unable to work remotely for all sorts of reasons. So in there as a starting point, but you need to have a bit of flexibility around that. But that face-to-face meetings are encouraged. I've worked with or listened to presentations from a number of fully remote companies, and they don't seem to worry about this at all. But I think face-to-face meetings are important, but you don't need an office to do that. And the important thing is you meet for a purpose. So don't go into an office because the rules say you have to be there. There has to be a purpose to a meeting. And there could be team meetings, that's getting product design, marketing meeting, all sorts of meetings, but face-to-face should be encouraged, but you don't need offices to do that. And you can see from the panel on the right and the words at the bottom. It's interesting that Owl Labs did a survey on the state of hybrid working. They frequently do these surveys. It's interesting that the majority of employees said they'd be happy to take a pay cut if they could work more flexibly. Whenever you talk to people or survey people, the word that always comes up, people working in offices, is flexibility. So the positives from that. So I think it is a positive approach. That you can see what's going on with a lot of companies at the moment is they've got this hybrid working. They can't really plan for going forwards, because I don't really think a lot of the people running the company actually believe in hybrid working, and they really want to get people back into the company. I think once you go for a flexible working approach and you stop worrying about offices, the offices aren't so important, then you've got a positive approach, and it allows you to plan the business going forwards. Happier staff, all the stuff I've alluded to before, and lower costs for the business because offices are incredibly expensive, and it's not just the expense of renting the offices. You have to look after these offices. You have somebody clean the toilets. You have to decorate the offices, rewire the offices. You know, I have a facilities team to look after the offices. There are a lot of costs to maintaining offices, but also it tends to reduce costs for employees because they're not doing all this commuting. And you know, some people will save on childcare costs, that sort of thing, or apparently animal care costs as well, I've read. And it is obviously easier to recruit the brightest and the best because you're looking at a much larger pool of people. They don't necessarily have to be within commuting distance of an office anymore because maybe you just don't have an office anyway. For all the reasons I've said before, and you know, lots of proof of that out there, productivity will increase. A tendency is if you recruit a bit more widely, then the diversity of your company will increase. And there's been a lot of work done on this as well. That Scott Page, University of Michigan, showed that diverse groups tend to outperform sort of like-minded groups. So diversity is good. Yeah, it's interesting. I think again that rails against an awful lot of the publicity that's coming out of well, actually not just the CEOs who want people back at work, but an awful lot of the press seems to push this as well. That company culture and being connected decreases, but in fact, from the surveys that have been done, that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, I'll get onto that in the next slide. You have to work at this stuff, but certainly it seems to be the opposite of what's being pushed out there. And I think the last bullet is really important. It tends to increase autonomy. You know, when you've got a more distributed group and you haven't got them all in an office, then command and control doesn't really work too well anymore. So, you know, people will be given more autonomy. That tends to enhance the agility and dynamism of the organization. And as was being said earlier, changes, particularly from AI, are becoming more and more rapid. And I think the organizations that don't have agility and dynamism will struggle. And the ones that do will cope with the change that's going in the world a lot better. So this isn't a free ticket. If you are going to do this, then you have to work at it. So, I mean, all companies should have a strategy, but you need to have, if you're going to give people autonomy, they need to have some boundaries to work within. Otherwise, you know, if you give people autonomy without a strategy, you just end up with chaos. So you need to have a strategy that's understandable and that gives people an understanding of, you know, the limits they can work within. You most definitely need to employ a head of flexible working. If you're going to make this you know, central to where you're working, you need to have someone who's going to be, you know, sort of in charge of it, looking after it, making sure it works. And I'd argue that that person should report into the board, although I guess in a lot of companies, they'd report into the HR director. So keep talking to staff. I think, especially if you're going to establish this in an existing company, you need to talk to staff to start with. Maybe you want to run some pilots that you involve staff in to try and find the best way of making this work. But you need to talk to staff and you need to carry on talking to staff. Employee engagement is important in any setup in company, but particularly in flexible working in a distributed company. You need to continuously engage staff in what they feel about how things are going. You need a flexible work policy so people know what they can and can't do, and there'll be all sorts of stuff in there, say health and safety, onboarding, communications, a whole lot of policies in there, so people understand how it all works. The panel down the right-hand side shows you the drawbacks with having people work more remotely, isolating, missing being part of the team, and social aspects. Well, all that stuff you really have to work out, and you need to look after people. Managers need to be more people focused, and the same meeting for a purpose. You do need to get people together and maybe have people working on social interaction as well. So you do need to work at that. Obviously, you need to communicate. If you put people together in an office, then clearly, obviously, they'll start talking to people next to them. If you have people working remotely, they won't do that. So you have to communicate at all levels with people and encourage people to communicate with each other and use the right channels of communication. As I said before, meet for a purpose. Don't just go to the office because you're told you have to go that day. Document your processes. All good businesses, if I can say that, should be doing this anyway, but it is more important in a flexible working environment. Classically, people say, well, the guys who know about the processes can't document them because they're too busy making the processes work, but I think that's a pretty lame excuse. All businesses should document the processes, but particularly important for this, build a knowledge base. So there's one place you can go, everybody can go to find out. Well, there's documents that are on here, but all documentation within the company. And again, I think that's what all companies should be doing. Every single IT support organization and probably non-IT support organization has a knowledge base so that everybody's learning from what everybody else is doing. There's no reason why people working, if you want to call it, in the back office shouldn't organize themselves in a similar way. Recruitment is important. You do want to recruit the sort of people who are good at written communications, particularly, who are flexible and adaptable. And you need to work hard at that, onboarding new employees who haven't had a job before. You need to work really hard, particularly hard at that. So, all the right sort of things, so that, all the recruitment is there on day one. You have an onboarding plan, and people set up to talk to people. You've got a org chart so people know how this company goes together. You do need to work really hard at this, obviously, in a flexible working, in a more remote working environment, and make sure you equip yourself with the right tools. And there are so many, particularly since the pandemic, that sort of area has exploded. Obviously, there's video conferencing, messaging, email. There's lots of project management and task management tools out there. Shared workspaces, knowledge base, and employee engagement software I mentioned earlier. So make sure you've got the whole thing set up so it's going to work.
Make an observation, Gren. How do you feel
Yes.
about? I mean, that's a very good list.
Yes.
But
I can write a longer one, actually.
One of the things we found is that
I was trying to reduce it for the if you buy
people
my
have-
book, you'll see there's a longer list in my book, but yeah.
people have different kinds of environments at home. So some people have got a study with a proper desk
Yes.
and dual screen and that kind of stuff, and they've got enough air and space to move around. I mean, I find it very useful to be able to change my posture. So, partway through the day, I like to raise my desk up. I can do that in the office, but I can't do that at home because the desk is too small. So make sure you invest enough in your employees' home work environment so that they can do this flexible working without having sort of drape themselves across the bed and work there.
Yes, there's an organization called Grow Work, who you can outsource the whole of this thing to. So they'll deliver, if you want them to, they'll deliver chairs, desks, IT equipment, if people have got room to accommodate it. So you can outsource this sort of thing to a third party who will check out all the health and safety stuff for you as well. Make sure people are working in in a good environment at home. So any other questions?
Another observation,
I've
perhaps.
obviously stunned them with my presentation, Imo.
Yeah, well, it's very good. You mentioned tools, and
Yes.
my company, Zuka, invested in a worldwide kind of site license for Miro about 4 years ago, and we now use it for just about everything.
I don't know, Miro. What's that? It's
Miro is a white body system,
okay.
and it was like the pioneer in the field, and it's still the best. There's quite a few imitators now,
Yeah,
but
no, that's
Mural,
quite a lot of
Mural,
the
for example, Mural is a free alternative, and it's almost as good. But if
video conferencing tools have whiteboarding built into them.
yes,
So yeah, there is an awful lot of software out there. I mean, project management particularly, there's literally project and task management, there are literally hundreds of packages. Quite how they're all managing to well, I don't think they are turning a profit. I think a lot of it is investment in the hope that it's risk capital to in the hope of finding a winner. But there's an awful lot of really good software out there to facilitate home working. What's the package I'm trying to think of? Remeet is a package worth looking at. If people are organizing meetings, it's a really different piece of software, and they've reimagined meetings, making meetings shorter and more topic based. It's a really unique piece of software worth people having a look at. Google that one.
sorry, can you spell that out?
It's just Remeet.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, what was that alternate to Miro?
I'm sorry, Shalal, what did you say?
You mentioned there is no alternate to Miro.
Oh, yes, it's Mural.
Mural, okay.
Look at that one. Yeah, if you want to have a look at, you can have a look at, say, Spotify particularly, and Adobe. Both run this sort of setup, and do seem to be hugely committed to it. So if you Google remote work or whatever with Spotify and Adobe, you'll find that I would agree with their philosophy that matches the sort of stuff I've said in here.
We're certainly not going to go back to 5 days a week in the office. For one thing, there wouldn't be much point because
Amazon are saying all their employees have to go back to 5 days a week in the office, having
yeah, I'm not quite sure whether they're set up in the same way as we are. We're a services company, and so we're working with clients all around the world anyway.
Yeah, but companies are doing this. Yeah,
yeah. So it has 20 different offices, many different countries, and so most project teams are mixtures of people from all of those places and from the customer. So there wouldn't be any point in trying to go to the office because you wouldn't meet anybody from your project team.
Yeah.
The reason to do it is because you have, an organizational unit that you want to meet with from time to time and discuss internal stuff.
Yes, obviously IT has led, generally IT and communications industries have led with remote working generally. And I guess not necessarily because of the nature of the job, also because obviously they are invested in the sort of facilities that, or software, hardware that facilitate this sort of working. And it seems sensible to people in those industries. Right. I'll stop the share then.